Hello, dear viewers. You are welcome to WStv. An oft repeated and widely believed and acclaimed lie, the myth that we confront at every nook and corner in intellectual circles of contemporary bourgeois society, is the independence of judiciary. But when the core question is raised next, independence from whom? We find people speaking for and reflecting concerns of different social classes. Marx had said that ideas of the ruling class are the dominant ideas of their times. An ideology is the systematic and coherently aligned organization of these ideas. Each society has its distinct ideologies that, in turn, are rooted in definite social classes within it. If liberalism was the ideology of rising bourgeoisie, then fascism is its ideology on its steep decline. Similarly, we can claim that Marxism is the ideology of the rising working class, that is to rule in future. We are always led by this or that ideology. Those who think and claim that they do not have an ideology, in fact, are unconsciously subjected to the dominant ideas of their times, that is, the ideology of the dominant class, the ideology of the ruling elite. Social, political, and legal institutions of a society refer to and reflect the corresponding ideologies of their ruling classes, with no exception at all. Where a tiny minority is raised to rule over the vast majority, it is immediately faced with a challenge to cover up its class rule with some ideological mysticism, some myth to create an illusion of democracy. Constitutions are written and a whole legal regime is put in place to create a delusion among the ruled mass that the political regime does not belong to the class, to any particular class, but to the law, to the people. So a whole farce is created. Farce of constitutionalism, farce of legalism. Holding the balance in its hands, the ruling class then balances the conflict of interests, chiefly the class interests, smoothens the edges of conflicts. In ancient times, it was done in the name of law of the God, law of the heaven. Today, it is the people's will that is used as a wheel for the dictatorship of a class, of a ruling elite, of a handful of ruling elite. While the ruling class holds this balance, it covers it up with rhetoric. Among the tautology of liberals who speak for and reflect the interests of a section of big capitalists, independence of judiciary finds an important place. From this independence, they deduce, above all, the freedom from the influence of popular masses. the mass of working people. They demand that judiciary must remain blind to the pressures from below. And that is crucial demand of ruling elite. Next, they also demand that it must be neutral to the rat race between sections of the ruling elite, between those who for the time being sit in the rule or those who are in opposition to it. So there must be balancing between the two within the ruling class, within the framework of the rule of ruling elite, inside the power corridors. Behind all liberal rhetoric of independence of judiciary lies the real craving of the ruling class, the class of big capitalists, to monopolize the control of judiciary, if not through visible influence directly, then through ideological influence indirectly, but definitely. After the liberals, independence of judiciary comes on the wish list of petty bourgeoisie that remains divided in innumerable layers and constitutes the vast social backyard of big bourgeoisie. Huge chunk of lawyers who talk of independence of judiciary so loudly in everyday affairs belongs to these layers of middle class of petty bourgeoisie that constitutes backyard of big bourgeoisie. A considerable majority in the population and harbinger of these liberal ideas, petty bourgeoisie demands in the loudest voice independence of judiciary. But given its social position, it demands that judiciary be independent of the influence of both the classes that stand above it and under it, from the big bourgeoisie and from the working class both. It demands, in the first place, the independence of judiciary from the pressure of the mass, and in that it follows the lead of liberals. But alongside it demands next the independence from the influence of the upper classes also, the ruling big business too. And then comes the turn of working class that has no real means to influence the judiciary and often remains the victim of class prejudice and extreme partiality. The working class needs the independence of judiciary from all influences from above, especially on higher echelons of judiciary. This influence may be seen unfailingly and more clearly. Not only the judge comes from the propertied classes and often belongs to the class of rich, elite and prosperous, but often he possesses a prejudice, an ideological prejudice, an ideology that reflects the interest of the big business. He or she favors and works to maintain the social status quo. Judiciary executes sovereignty of the state in its specific field. Its prime task is to balance the conflicting interests within the bourgeois society and to smoothen the rough edges in situation of conflicts. Through this act of balancing, it maintains the status quo. As a balance holder, judiciary is executor of the sovereignty but not a shareholder in it. Sovereignty lies beyond and above it and above the state as a whole. Liberals have taken to search for sovereignty, but in vain. From Austin to Cardozo, they have searched for sovereignty in bourgeois parliaments and constitutions. This has obviously turned to fiasco. Intangible sovereignty is something higher than the constitution itself and to the whole political regime under it. That includes state as well. Sovereignty cannot be established through constitutions or parliaments or other bourgeois institutions. The role of constitution lies primarily in providing a framework for execution of sovereignty and in covering up, and that is more important, in covering up its class essence through hypocritical juridical jargons and demagogy. Making of the constitution rather presupposes pre-existence of sovereignty that must find resonance of its will through the constitution. Constitution is nothing but political manifesto of the ruling class. It reflects and must reflect the will of the sovereign class. In contemporary society, we can safely say that the constitutions in all countries, they reflect the will of the ruling bourgeoisie, bourgeois elite, the class of big capitalists, big investors, big business, big corporate. State, including judiciary, is merely the executing agency of this sovereignty. So how it can be independent? Judiciary is an arm of the state that executes the sovereign command in real world, on the ground. It is thus obviously servile to sovereign class, the ruling elite of big capitalists, big investors, big business, big corporate. And then the question arises, where lies the real sovereignty? Who holds the real strings of power? The sovereignty is rooted in the joint will of an apex gang of big corporate sharks that has no institutional status or legal structure or a defined framework, but still sits at the commanding heights of the invisible regime and controls it from behind the screens through thousands of strings that can be traced back to its coffers, its chests. For example, for illustration, I'll give you an illustration. For example, in India, we may say without fail that the sovereignty lies in the hands of the gang of Adanis and Ambanis. All right-wing bourgeois establishments, it is not about only India, but all over the world, all right-wing bourgeois establishments have their left wing to keep them flying. Occasionally, they have to lean upon it to dupe their prey. To the less insightful representatives of the propertied classes, this appears to be pernicious populist influence. They want the judiciary to be totally free of such pressures. Pressures from the below, pressures from the mass. So this is the top wish of ruling elite, that the judiciary must be free of all influences from mass pressures from below. And then sovereignty has a historic trajectory of its own in every single country, and that includes India also. For example, in India, it comes from ancient kingdoms to great empires, and from them to British rule and then to Indian capitalists. One cannot err in seeing through the history that at each step, sovereignty was sought through brute force, the force of arms, the force of the policy of iron and blood. It were British capitalists, the colonialists, that executed the historic task of snatching sovereignty away from the hands of disintegrating empires in India, chiefly Mughal Empire. British guns did it. They handed it over then to their native cousins, the Indian capitalists, in 1947, in a shameful compromise. Indian capitalists betrayed our freedom movement and jealously assisted their British cousins in aborting our revolution, imposing on us the bloodiest tragedy in human history, the tragic communal partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. Through this reactionary violence only, that claimed more than 2 billion lives and left 20 million more maimed, raped, or displaced, the gang of Indian capitalists could take to power in a shameful compromise with colonialists and became sovereign. So here comes, this is the source of the sovereignty. Here comes the sovereignty. Through shameful compromise with British capitalists who had snatched the power with the force of the guns. Democracies around the world formally declare sovereignty of the people. But this formal declaration does not answer the core question. It is unable to answer this core question. Who possesses the sovereignty in the name of the people? Where lies the tangible sovereignty? Britain declares supremacy of the House, while US and India declare supremacy of the Constitution. But fortunately or unfortunately, sovereignty lies beyond the precincts of the Constitution and the parliaments both. Contrary to all phony claims of liberals, sovereignty in a class-divided society can never emanate out of the people as a whole, nor can it ever belong to them at all. Sovereignty is rooted in the dominance of a class over the society, and finally, inside this dominance also finally, in a clique of big sharks over the class in power. So finally it is a small gang, a handful of elites that hold the reins of sovereignty. In essence, sovereignty is invisible and indivisible. It is epitome of the state. The sovereignty cannot be divided, and sovereignty cannot be touched. What is divided among the three arms of the state, the parliament, the executive, and the judiciary, is not the sovereignty, but the functioning of the state, the duty for execution of sovereignty. It is the duty that is divided, not the sovereignty itself. Sovereignty remains indivisible. It is the duty to execute that sovereignty which is divided among the three arms of the state, executive, judiciary, and legislature. Praising the French Commune for concentrating the legislative, executive, and judicial functions of the state into its hands, vanishing all hypocrisy. Marx wrote that it was an organ that made the laws, executed them, and adjudicated upon them. The liberal state, in order to cover up the essence and mechanics of sovereignty, keeps its state divided among legislative, executive, and judicial bodies. Shunning all pretense of democracy, fascism unites them back into one. The class of big capitalists de facto rules in the name of the people. The day people as a whole will be sovereign, the sovereignty will lose its status and its meaning both. That means that would be the stage when the state itself would wither away, all sovereignty would wither away, and the society will be remaining in a cohesion. Liberal claim that judiciary can be free of the influence of ruling elite or can be independent of other organs of the state is a farce in absolute terms and an illusion of worst kind to make the people, the subject people, blind to the reality that the state is a handmaid in the hands of a handful of ruling elite. Independence of judiciary is the story of Chanda Mama, where liberals play the role of clever mother, enticing the baby with what she knows is an illusion, is a farce, is a lie. The mother knows that the moon is a satellite of earth, but still she entices the baby with holy rhymes about it. Our petty bourgeois is allured the same way to believe the myth of independence of judiciary, where the ruling elite, the big bourgeoisie, plays the mother. Petty bourgeois has no insight and no vision of its own. In simple terms, we can understand petty bourgeois as middle class. So it has no insight and no vision of its own to understand the deep workings of the sovereignty, constitution, and the state emanating out of it. It seeks the dynamics of the world only in the sermons of the liberals. Constitution and constitutional democracy both are founded on liberal foundations. The monster of fascism is though threatening them today. In fact, trampling upon them. It has tightened its deadly noose around the neck of all constitutional institutions, be it parliament or the court. Totally crushed under the boots of fascism, what liberals are vying for today is not the independence of judiciary in abstract terms, but, in fact, salvation from the stranglehold of fascism and its pernicious influence that threatens the very foundation of constitutional democracy, the dictatorship, the wheeled dictatorship of big capitalists that has remained hitherto wheeled. But simultaneously, they are afraid of laying it threadbare. They are afraid of telling the truth to the masses that what they demand is nothing but the wheeled dictatorship of capitalists, as against the fascist rant for naked dictatorship. They are demanding independence of judiciary without qualifying it further, that for them the subjection of judiciary can have one meaning only: subjection to pernicious influence of fascism. Fascism is antithetical to constitutional democracy. Its scheme, its institutions, and its framework as a whole. It advocates complete and open merger of the state and the corporate. This is what our liberals are scornfully complaining today. Constitutional democracies are essentially founded on liberal value system. Indian elite has copied its constitution from countries of advanced capitalism, cutting it to its own midget stature. The claim that subordination of judiciary under extraneous influences is a recent phenomenon, as the liberals accuse fascism of it, is totally misplaced and a blatant lie. State and its organs, courts included, since their inception, had always been in the grip of big capitalists and subordinate to their will, the will of the ruling elite, of the ruling class. They have always worked with class perspective and often class prejudice. But liberals did never complain till this dictatorship of big capitalists remained covered up, veiled behind the demagogy and illusions. They are complaining now when fascism is tearing down from inside the wheel of democracy, of equality, of freedom, together with the independence of state and judiciary, when it is exposing everything threadbare. So in the age of fascism, now liberals have become complainants. Liberals want to keep the dictatorship veiled, dictatorship of the big capitalists. They want to keep it veiled, covered up. Fascists feel no need for any such veneers. The less favored or the last favored lot that is ill-fated to live on crumbs of ruling capitalist elite is our petty bourgeoisie, our middle class, the layers of middle class, thousands of layers of middle class. While the gang of big capitalists rules, it continues to reflect and deflect its desperation. I'm talking about middle class. Through accusations of cronyism or nepotism. In the era of fascism, petty bourgeoisie is suffocating with direct and open nexus between the top capitalists and the government on one hand, and between judiciary and executive on the other. Its rant for independence of judiciary is in fact a protest against this nexus, which it thinks is unpious and unconstitutional. It is not against the nexus between the state and capital in general, that excludes the working and toiling people and stands against them. It only opposes the nexus between the big capital and the state to the extent that it excludes its own class, the class of petty traders, shopkeepers, and businessmen, small businessmen. In nutshell, it stands only against exclusion of its own class and demands independence of judiciary only to that extent. So far as working class is concerned, it knows by its everyday experience and its learning through the lens of Marxism that there can be no independent state, much less an independent judiciary. It knows that sovereignty lies in the class and state is the instrument to execute it. It knows that behind the wheel of constitutions and constitutional democracies around the world stands the naked dictatorship of the class of big capitalists. Working class thus does not chase the farce of any independence of judiciary, but fights for the goal of a socialist revolution that will put all power in its own hands, in the hands of the working class, on the ashes of the old state together with its constitution and constitutionalism, constitutional democracy. So that's all, dear friends. We deliberated on independence of judiciary, and in future we will be with you on all important subjects of political significance and of crucial importance. So bye for today. It was nice to have you with us as listeners. Good night, friends.